All right, shalom, shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Bahashim, Ruach. Double honors to the elder apostles, the elder bishops, the elders of Great Millstone, who rule very well, very beautifully. Double salutations be unto the Akim, out here pushing this gospel in truth and in sincerity to the best of their ability, given to them by Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai. Peace, blessings, and salutations be unto the elect scattered abroad. May the election of Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Lord willing, fall upon all your houses. This is a brother Quana Wath coming back at you, Lord will, with the edifying lesson through the spirit and power of Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Lord will. It is edifying, Lord will. It is straight to the point. And in this lesson, right, I ultimately want to speak on, the fact that, America and Israel, had ultimately, began this war, right, against Iran, and Iran, ultimately, closing the Strait of Hormuz, right, is heavily affecting, the rest of the world, right? There's been more and more talks by these economists that there is going to be, a global economic collapse, which is putting these nations, in a very tight spot, economically, financially, and it's all because of, America and Israel, right? As the scriptures say, the least of the flock shall draw them out, right? Which we know the least of the flock is ultimately, the small hats, the 1948ers, biblically called the Amalekites, who are ultimately Edomites, man. These nations are going through it because of, what America and Israel, right, are ultimately doing, man. Which is ultimately going to lead to, which as we're seeing now, right, it's going to lead to the ultimate fulfillment of Revelation 16 and verse 17, right, that these nations who are allied, with America, right, are ultimately going to turn on America, right, and we're starting to see that more and more, But let me start right here, because again, we were given all these different signs, right? One of these signs is that these nations, right, will be in perplexity, right? This is Luke 21 and verse 25. You see the header, it says the return of Hamashiach. And again, we've been given many different signs, right? You go into Isaiah 29 and 26, right? It says what flames are devouring fire, right? The last few years, right? Last 5-6 years, we've been seeing a lot of, different states here in America, right? Up in flames, California, Arizona, Nevada. Right now, you got Nebraska up in flames, man. They're talking about over 800,000 acres, right, have ultimately burned, right? And then it also says what, right? Storm and tempest. You had that storm that was coming through in Australia, right? And prior to that storm coming through, you had the sky ultimately turned red, and then immediately after, the next day, there was a really bad storm that happened, in Australia, right? And then as well as you had, on the Passover, you had that pink moon, right? Which I've never heard of, no pink moon, right? But you ultimately had it, right? Brothers have, pictures and brothers were doing lessons on it, which are those different signs that we were given, right? That Yahweh Shai is on his way, right? So Luke 21:25, it says, and there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon. Again, right there, you got that. You've had a lot of blood moons lately, right? You've had a lot of eclipses. You had that pink moon, all of this, happened. You even had a whole bunch of meteorites, coming down, man. I haven't seen that many, in my lifetime. This is the first time, right? It says, and in the stars and upon the earth, distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. So I want to go into these words, right? Distress and perplexity, right? Because this is, again, because of this war, right, that America and Israel are waging, on Iran, right? These other, these nations, especially, in Europe, and really just, all, including America, right, are all, feeling that hurt because of, Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz, right? So this is the words distress, Luke 21:25, distress, Sanoke, right? Strong's G 49:28. It says what? Straits, right? Distress, anguish, right? Let's go to the root word, right? It says to press together with the hand. It says of a besieged city, right? Of a strait, right? So again, these nations, right, are going, are being, pressed on every side, if you will. You know, their economies are being affected, highly affected. Because you got a lot of these different, cargo ships, aren't being, coming through the Strait of Hormuz, man. Which means none of these nations are getting their products. Now you do have some, some of these cargo ships, they are coming through, the Strait of Hormuz, right, going through what they're calling the Iranian toll, toll booth, if you will. But majority of these cargo ships are not making it through, and that's holding up, right? India, right? They ultimately, rely on that form of gas. I think it's LPG or something like that, if I'm not mistaken, right? And they were, you have people rioting and whatnot, based off of the fact that, hey, that's where most of their gas comes from, or that most of their, energy, right, comes from, is the LPG gas. And I could be saying the acronym wrong, but that's what they rely on. But see, they just now recently, I think it was last week, they had gotten, a couple ships that came through, after, a few weeks long of none of it coming through, man. That's how quickly, right, they're affected. You got many different countries, which we're going to get into. I asked ultimately, ask ChatGPT, like, what different nations, right, are being affected as of right now, man. And we're going to get into that, right? It says, right, just again, right, just going into the, the basic point where I said what they put in straits, distress, anguish, But let's go back to that word perplexity, right? Strong's G 640, apareia. It says the state of one who is in perplexity. Root word, right? It says to be without resources, to be in straits, to be left wanting, to be embarrassed, to be in doubt, not to know which way to turn. And this is the position that these nations are in. You are having, again, you got a lot of these nations that are, going through an energy crisis. Prices are skyrocketing. Let's grab this. Because it says, because again, I asked that, on chat. This is the question I asked. It says, what nations are facing a economic and financial crisis based off the war America is waging with Iran? It says right now it's not just one or two countries. This is hitting entire regions. But some nations are clearly closer to full-blown economic or financial crisis than others. Right? It gives a breakdown. It says countries already in or very close to crisis. It says Philippines declared a national energy emergency, imports 98% of its oil. Extremely vulnerable, right? So, and we know that, 1/5 of the world's oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz, right? Which is a huge, a huge player, right, in the, in the energy sector. It says fuel shortages plus inflation rising fast, right? It said this one is the clearest examples of country already tipping into crisis. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Vietnam, right? It says facing fuel shortages, price spikes, and instability. And see, they should throw Australia in there as well, because I think it was a majority of, or a huge portion of, the Australian gas, stations and whatnot, a lot of them have run out at least one type, of gasoline or oil, man, So people are running around, going from gas station to gas station so they can get, gas, man. It says heavy dependence on imported oil, right, plus weak currencies. Already fragile economies, risk of debt crisis and unrest, right? These are high-risk collapse zones, especially if oil stays high. Then it says Iran, right? It says Iran was already in deep economic crisis, inflation over 40%, widespread poverty, war plus sanctions, right? Then it says countries under severe economic stress could slide into crisis, right? The UK, Europe, right? It says especially Germany and Italy. It says facing energy shortages plus industrial slowdown, inflation rising, growth falling, risk of stagflation or recession. Europe is not collapsing, but is being hit hard structurally. And, America, right, in the EU, right, have, had very close ties, very, very close ties up until the last few years, man. Especially going back 2024 when, Saudi Arabia ultimately exited, that deal, that deal to ultimately trade, or sell their oil in the dollar, right? Which ultimately kept the dollar, on top, but it's been 2 years since then, and we're seeing a huge decline in nations utilizing the dollar, you know, especially again, the so-called Middle Eastern, countries, right? Iran, even Venezuela, which is one of the reasons why America came after Venezuela, because they were trading and selling oil in the Chinese yuan, man. You know, so America had to ultimately, take that, so that way they can, ultimately stay in power, or to try to stay in power. But see, we're seeing the fall of this wicked and evil rulership, man. You know, because America's really stepping on its own allies' toes, man. A lot of these different nations that are feeling this pressure, a lot of them at one point were allied with America, right? And are currently allied with America. But see, as America continues to wage war, and make threats against Iran, it's going to be to the point where these nations are going to turn on America, right? Because America's dealings, right, are affecting them, right, in a negative way, right? It says Japan, South Korea, India, right? Heavy dependence on imported oil from the Gulf, rising fuel plus transport costs, governments tapping reserves and adjusting policy, right? It says Asia is one of the most exposed regions overall, right? Then it says Egypt, Turkey, Sri Lanka, and it says in similar import dependent states, not all named explicitly in reports, but these countries historically suffer most from food price spikes, energy imports, currency pressure, right? It says these are domino risk economies. They can fall quickly. And then it goes, what? Countries feeling pressure but not yet in crisis. United States, Australia, Brazil, you know. And then it says what's driving all of this? Oil shock, biggest factor. Up to 30% of global oil flows disrupted. Prices over $100 per barrel. Strait of Hormuz disruption, global choke point, right? And then it talks about, food, fertilizer, global inflation, debt pressure, so on and so forth, right? And then it gives you a little bottom line, right? You got many countries that are ultimately facing, crisis, right? Whether they're going to be, or they're in a crisis, or they're about to be facing a crisis, whether economically or financially. Most of these nations have, they're allied or partners with America, and again, that's going to cause for these nations to turn against America, because America's not going to stop, man. America's a big ass fucking bully, It says right here, we'll jump to it, in Revelation 16 and verse 17, it says, and the seventh angel poured out his vial into the air. What is it? 17 to 16, slack. Right, 17 to 16. It says, in the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, right, which ultimately go back to, the EU, those vassal states, right, which now I think makes up of 31 different, European countries, it says, in the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore being who? Right, Babylon the Great, right, aka America, right, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire, meaning they're going to turn against America, right, and eventually we are part of the nations that push the button and those nuclear missiles go flying and they hit America, right? They're gonna be partakers in sending those nuclear missiles, man. You know, because of America, because of America making moves. You don't sat here and opened it up. These treaties, right? North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You didn't sat there and made a treaty. With NATO. You know, and you're saying, hey, you're setting up, help set up, the different laws and policies within that treaty or within that organization, and you're not even keeping them, right? Article 5, right, which means that if any NATO country is to be attacked, then all the NATO members have to ultimately, back, that country that's being attacked. But see, America don't do that. America's constantly breaking treaties, constantly, backstabbing its allies. You now have it to where America's saying, no, we're not. You want oil, go and get it yourself, right? Get your own oil, right? And he's speaking to his allies, man. These nations are starting to close down, their airports, their bases and whatnot to America, making it to where the America can't house their soldiers or anything like that. They're saying no, they're done dealing with America, man. Let's go to Obadiah in the 7th. I want to grab it in the NLT though. Right, I want to grab it in the NLT. It says, Obadiah verse 7, it says, all your allies will turn against you, right? They will help to chase you from your land. They will promise you peace while plotting to deceive and destroy you. See, this is what's going on behind the scenes, man. A lot of these, and it's becoming more evident, right? America's longest, standing allies, the UK, France, right, are looking at America like, what the fuck are you doing? We're looking at Daniel's the 2nd chapter playing out, right? And we're going to grab that. It says, they will promise you peace while plotting to deceive and destroy you. Your trusted friends will set traps for you and you won't even know about it, man. You got Donald Trump, which, we think he's over here just bullshitting, man. Right? Bullshitting the people. We understand that he's been doing, damage control and when it comes to this war, and he's been blowing smoke up the people's ass, right? Because we understand Esau Edom, right? We understand that he wants, the least amount of resistance, man. So he doesn't want to tell you people really what's going on over there, and how Iran is kicking the shit out of America and Israel, and you got more and more nations joining Iran. More and more nations are turning against America, right? They're not going to say all that, man. Because then people would flip the fuck out because you believe that America's, most of these people, they believe that America is untouchable. They believe that America, has the strongest army in the world, But that shit's coming to an end, Again, we're looking at Daniel's the 2nd chapter playing out, right? It's Daniel's chapter 2. Let me go back to KJV. 2 and verse 40. We'll start at verse 40. It says Rome, right? Which we know America is the modern day Rome, right? Rome 2.0, right? Spiritually Rome, right? It says in the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all things, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And again, right, this is speaking about, that fourth beast, right, the Roman Empire, right? But see, as you read in Revelation, the 13th chapter, that fourth beast, right, it was, it had a deadly wound, but it was healed, right? It was healed through who? Through America. That Roman Empire, that Roman philosophy ultimately came back via America. So America is Rome 2.0. Verse 41, it says, and whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. Right, and America has been, on top for so long. You know, America has been on top for so long, but now we're seeing, that division, you know, as you read in what is that, Matthew 12 and 25, right? If a kingdom be divided against itself, it shall not stand, right? You got Edomites, right? The French, they're Edomites. The Russians, the Germans, you know, all these different Edomite nations, the Spanish, the Spaniards, right? Those are Edomites, and they're all against America. They're all against Israel and America, right? They're divided against themselves, man. Which is again another sign of this current empire rulership, going down. Verse 42, it says, "And as the toes of the feet were part iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay." Right? You're going to have that division. You're going to have that split, and we're seeing it, right? And again, it's going to lead to the downfall, of America, right? Those nations, right, shooting those missiles, on America, right? And this is prophecy, right? This is Jeremiah chapter 50, right? As you read at the top, it says what? Prophecy against Babylon, right? It says, dropping down, I mean, this whole chapter is fire, but I'm just getting to the point. Jeremiah 15 verse 9, it says, "For lo, I will raise and cause to come up against Babylon an assembly of great nations from the north country," that north country being Russia, and then assembly of great nations, meaning, the nations that, such as Iran, nations like North Korea, nations like, America's allies, France, Germany, Spain, all these different nations, right? Those who are allied with, China and their allies, are going to come up against America, come up against Babylon, right? It says, "And they shall set themselves in array against her. From thence she shall be taken. Their arrows shall be as of a mighty expert man. None shall return in vain," right? None shall return in vain. You read Joel, the second chapter, it talks about those nuclear missiles, man. How they're not going to break the ranks. They're not going to be, you're going to, you try to shoot them down, and you're not going to be able to, shoot them down, right? Because they're going to be not only, is Yahweh Bashim Al Shai going to allow them to, be shot off, but he's going to ultimately guide those missiles, man, over to America and make sure that they hit. That is, prophecy, man. That is the fullness of World War III, where America ultimately gets hit, with ICBM nuclear missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, man. Right? It says, "And Chaldea shall be a spoil, all that spoil her shall be satisfied, saith Yahweh, Bahashim Yahushua." It says, "Because you were glad, because you rejoiced, O ye destroyers of mine heritage, because ye are grown fat as the heifer at grass, and bellow as bulls, your mother shall be sore confounded." That mother's ultimately going into, the UK, the British, right? Because America ultimately came out of, came from the UK, split from the UK, right? Going back to, prior to, 1776, right? And moving forward from there, right? It says, "She that bare you shall be ashamed. Behold, the hindermost of the nations shall be a wilderness, a dry land, and a desert." That's what's prepared for America, right? For Babylon, right? It says, "Because of the wrath of the Lord, Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, it shall not be inhabited, but it shall be wholly desolate. Everyone that goeth by Babylon shall be astonished and hiss at all her plagues," man. And see, this is, something that, we're constantly throwing up prayers for, right? Constantly throwing up curses against this place, man. Right? That Yahweh Bashim El Shai destroy this place ASAP. And we know that it's happening fast, right? We've been given all these different signs, right? And we're seeing it, right? Perplexity of the nations, these nations being, in distress, based off of the moves that, America and Israel are making, which again is going to lead to these nations coming up against Babylon, coming up against America, and burning her, right? Setting those nuclear missiles and destroying this place, man. And we can't wait, man. Lord will, it happens very soon, man. And we know it's going to happen soon, man. At this point, it's months, right? It's not necessarily years, right? At this point, it's months, man. And we can, we can see it afar off, man. And it's not too far off. So with that, that's all I got, man. Lord will was edifying, Lord, straight to the point. I want to give all praise, all glory to Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shah, Bahashim, or Chak Wadash, double honor to the elder apostles, the elder bishops, the elders of Great Millstone. Till next time, I say Shalom.